Okay, welcome everyone to the last event of Dope 10, a keynote address by Dr. Alaka Wali. I'm Olivia Meyer, your conference chair. Thank you. Okay, so before we get started, I'd like to welcome Yulia from UC Santa Cruz to the stage.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yulia. I am a PhD candidate in film and digital media at UC Santa Cruz. I am also a Wildcat striker. Thank you. So while I'm here, my comrades are on the picket line in Santa Cruz. I will give you a brief update about the strike and why I'm here in front of you speaking. I'm gonna try to click through this. Oh, I do? There we go. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So you see Santa Cruz graduate student workers are on a wildcat strike for a cost of living adjustment, or COLA. They have been on strike since December 2019 and continue to withhold their labor to demand a living wage. Like student workers across all University of California campuses, from Riverside to Merced, graduate student workers get paid $19,000 a year after tax. But in Santa Cruz, one of the most unaffordable cities in the country, we spend 50 to 70% of our wages on rent. That's why Santa Cruz grad students are striking. Student workers are paid the same while we can't survive. We're demanding a cost of living adjustment, an additional monthly payment to all graduate students to account for an exorbitant cost of living and cost of rent in Santa Cruz. In December, we began a wildcat strike and withheld 4 full quarter grades, to which the administration responded with threats of discipline. Incensed by the threat, strikers escalated to a full labor stoppage on February 10th. So UCSC is spending on average $300,000 a day on extra police force to send over 100 police officers in riot gear to police and brutalize students. 18 students were arrested on week 1 of the strike, and all injuries reported are exclusively a result of police violence. Apart from discipline, intimidation, and heavy policing, yesterday, nearly 80 strikers already received letters of termination, and letters are keep coming. We are fired, and it not only exacerbates the financial situation that led to the strike in the first place, but for international and undocumented students, termination jeopardizes our status in the country. Other UC campuses, including Santa Barbara and Davis, joined UCSC COLA strike last Thursday in solidarity and demanding their own COLA. So you can support students striking for a living wage and for an equal access to the vocation of teaching and researching. We want to see an academy that is accessible to Indigenous, Black and students of color, trans and queer, undocumented and international, disabled, and poor students. And you can support this campaign by donating to the strike fund. There's a tiny URL link on top of this page. You can follow us on social media. It's Pay Us More UCSC on Twitter and Instagram. And by boycotting the UC until it pays all students and workers a living wage. Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia. I know that the Political Ecology Working Group, and I'm sure everyone here at DOPE really supports the work you all are doing. And after what Dr. Elmhurst said at the welcome address about the strikes in the UK, I think it's really good to make these connections. Okay, so I also have a couple of announcements before our keynote event. Yesterday, I thanked our sponsors who have made this conference possible. Tonight, we want to give special thanks to the Student Sustainability Council that has been integral in keeping DOPE running. So I would like to welcome our brilliant SSC representative to say a few words. Please welcome Olivia Tussey.
Hi, everybody. So as she said, we're just kind of switching out one Olivia for another. I'm Olivia Tussey, and I'm a freshman environmental and sustainability studies major here at UK. And this year, I've had the honor of being Pugh's chosen representative on UK's Student Sustainability Council. The Sustainability Council is a group of students chosen to decide on the allocation of UK's $4 environmental stewardship fee that all students have to pay. It was founded in 2009 in order to allow environmentally minded students a chance to decide on funding allocations for sustainability projects and events on campus. It's been an amazing experience for me so far. I'm one of the only freshmen on the council, which means I'm always surrounded by and getting learned from people who are much older than me. I'm getting to see the kinds of ideas that UK students have to bring more awareness to environmental sustainability, and the huge variety of ways that they plan to implement them is so eye-opening and exciting for me. This year we started off with almost $200,000 in funding to give out, and so far we have been able to fund projects such as a student-run sustainability magazine, the UK Solar Car team, a robot-tended greenhouse, and several internships. Most importantly to all of us here today, the SSC has helped to fund DOPE conferences for 10 years now, or every year since the council and conference were first founded, for a grand total of almost $75,000 in funding for DOPE. I would just like to emphasize once again how wonderful my experience at the SSC has been so far this year, and I encourage any UK students here interested to apply to be on the council for next year or to apply for funding, because we still have a lot of money we'd like to give out. And lastly, I want to express my thanks to Pugh's Olivia Meyer and Jack Swab for trusting me to represent them in this position back when I was only about a month into my college education. Thank you all, and have an amazing rest of your conference.
It is so meaningful to have the support of the SSC and our other sponsors that make it possible to bring international speakers, hold competitions, and facilitate so many conference events. So thank you, Olivia. Also, you have a great name. Okay, so now I'd like to welcome Corinne Turkowicz and Karen Kinslow to come to announce the winners of the SSC-sponsored undergraduate paper competitions.
So we will actually be announcing two winners. We have an undergraduate and a graduate winner. For the undergraduate, I had the pleasure of seeing this paper. And so when I call your name, please stand up and we can give you a round of applause. So with the paper titled A Little Justice, Settler Colonialism, Shasta Dam, and Metabolic Rift in California's Hydrologic Cycle, please put your hands together for Theo Claire. Theo is from Mount Holyoke College, studies environmental studies, and I cannot emphasize how amazing their work is.
For the graduate paper competition, I'd like to announce Jack Leff, a PhD student in Science, Technology, and Society program at Virginia Tech, the paper entitled Expanding Effective Atmospheres.
Yeah, Jack! So thank you to everyone who submitted their papers for both the undergraduate and the graduate paper competitions. They were all wonderful papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne and Karen. We also have a photo competition and a poster competition sponsored by CAPE, the Cultural and Political Ecology Specialty Group of the American Association of Geographers. CAPE aims to promote scholarly activities, integrating the cultural, political, economic, and biophysical dimensions of resource use and environmental change, focusing on these issues and their linkages at and across multiple scales, temporal and spatial. So I'd like to ask Jong-hee to come up and announce our photo competition, and we'll have to wait a little bit for the poster competition announcement in the next couple of days on our website.
Before announcing the winner of the competition, I would like to call attention to our photo competition, which we started just this year. So we will continue this competition following year. So please be keen to this. Yeah. So we are very honored to present this the first first photo competition winner, who is Nicola Sheffield. Where is yeah? Please give her a big round of applause. Her photo entitled "Leaked" portrays the human and nature interaction in a way that people does not necessarily acknowledge it or look at. Yeah. Thank you for everyone who submit the great photos. Yeah.
Finally, our keynote event this evening is sponsored by the Year of Equity, a University of Kentucky initiative marking the 70th anniversary of UK's desegregation. The Year of Equity seeks to spark meaningful dialogue on issues across race, gender, ability, sexuality, class, ethnicity, citizenship status, and religion on our own campus in central Kentucky and around the globe. The Year of Equity grant made this event possible and allowed us to open the event to the broader university and Lexington public. Next, I'm going to announce Drs. Mary Anglin and Anne Kingsolver, who will be introducing Dr. Alaka Wali this evening. Dr. Anglin is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology here at UK, studying the relationship between gender, ethnicity, race, structures of oppression, and practices of resistance and agency related to the medical anthropology and public health. Meanwhile, Dr. Kingsolver is a professor of anthropology who studies political economy and power through participatory research perspectives, and whose ethnographic fieldwork has been in the US, Mexico, and Sri Lanka. Please give Drs. Anglin and Kingsolver a warm welcome.
I'm Anne. It's delightful to have with us as the keynote speaker for this 10th Dimensions of Political Ecology Conference, Dr. Alaka Wali. Could we please collectively first recognize the labor and vision of all of those students who've invited her to be here, who've organized this conference, and who've been part of the Political Ecology Working Group in the past that's grown this conversation, as well as those who've lived on and stewarded this ground in the past, and those whose labor maintains this space and brings energy to it. Those students. Thanks. Dr. Alaka Wali has lived and practiced always an anticipatory political ecology, seeing, encouraging, and building connections across identities, political divides, generations, continents, urban, rural, community, university, and human beyond human intersections, so that all can flourish. Such generative work has never been more vital than in these times when children lead the informed call for accountability to the earth, and the politics of violent capitalist accumulation threaten well-being everywhere. Alaka Wali earned her anthropology BA from Harvard and MA, MPhil, and PhDs from Columbia University, has led several national anthropology organizations, represented the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences in the National Academy of Sciences, and received the American Anthropological Association's President's Award in 2013. But it's not her disciplinary accomplishments I want to follow in these brief remarks. It's her lifelong commitment to an anticipatory and inclusive political ecology. 12 years ago, she co-led the project Engaging Chicago's Communities with the Climate Change Action Plan. 25 years ago, she created a forum for participatory pedagogy on multiculturalism and identity in the U.S. For 2 decades, she's been a leader in outreach for the RACE Project, a national project facilitating critical understandings of structural racism, racializing processes, and racial justice. She says that she was shaped by growing up in the U.S. during the Civil Rights Movement in a family that had recently immigrated from India. The cross currents of the Black Power movement, the American Indian movement, El Movimiento, the Poor People's Campaign, and the Women's Movement, as well as other social, economic, and environmental justice movements that have followed since the 60s and 70s, are all evident in her work. Alaka Wali was hired as the director of the Field Museum's Center for Cultural Understanding and Change in Chicago in 1995, and has worked at the Field Museum in several different capacities since then, as well as having academic appointments at the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, and the University of Illinois at Chicago. She says that when she joined the Field Museum, she was given a mandate to make the museum more relevant to the people of Chicago. and she definitely has, in ways that provide examples to all of us, wherever we are, that are very relevant in this moment. I'll mention just a few of those. She and Rosa Cabrera founded the Chicago Cultural Alliance and its Cultural Connections program, which brought people together for conversations across differences that engaged painful histories of marginalization and found ways to really connect and act across differences in Chicago. Alaka Wali has consistently supported young people, which I see as key work in anticipatory political ecology. She's trained young people in community ethnography and critical journalism, founded after-school programs for marginalized young people, and has served as an advisor on minority education to school systems, and is a trustee of the youth organization Umbrella. She's also worked on spaces for community life in Chicago, like the Reclaiming Parks for Nature and Community project she did, and her many recent projects on urban gardening, urban forest biodiversity, and ethnobotanical strategies for well-being in Chicago. She's presented and published dozens and dozens of papers and articles and videos and books and reports on topics including hydropower-related refugee resettlement and resistance to forced relocation across several nations of Central and South America, cultural responses to climate change, museums as sites of activism, the intersections of cultural and biological diversity, and work that Mary Anglin will talk more about in a moment. But one of my favorite of Alaka Wali's publications is her co-authored book, written very clearly, called Collaborative Research, A Practical Introduction to Participatory Action Research, which students have found enormously helpful. Alaka Wali has made the Field Museum an activist space, in keeping with the rest of her commitments, through her exhibit practice. I'll share just a few of the titles of exhibits she has curated or created over the years, which have been engaged by thousands of visitors and have also traveled through communities to spark conversations elsewhere. The Art of Being Kuna, Celebrating Women, Road to Freedom, Sacred Water, the Kumbh Mela, Fractured, North Dakota's Oil Boom, Living Together, Common Concerns, Different Responses, Urban Gardens, Growing Chicago's Communities, and the permanent exhibit, Restoring Earth. Mary Anglin will now give a few more introductory remarks, and then we'll hear from Dr. Wali. Thanks for being here with us today.
Mine's on a slightly more personal note, and I want to just say thanks for letting me have a brief chance to talk about my good friend and colleague, Alka Wali, whom I've known since the mid-1990s when she was working with Leith Mullings on the Harlem Birthright Project. Without going into too many details, what I've appreciated and learned from Alaka is about her fierce and long-term commitment to collaborative and activist-focused practices in research, in publications, and in her work with the Field Museum. Alaka has challenged her colleagues, myself included, in anthropology to think more carefully about what it would mean in strategic and practical terms to engage in transformative research practices, pedagogies, and ways of life. I continue to learn from her and am grateful for her brilliant work through the Harlem Birthright Project, with the American Anthropological Association, and Anne mentioned a couple things, but I want to mention at least a couple more. One of them is the Anthropologists Go Back to School initiative, as well as an initiative to establish community-driven and community-located meetings in conjunction with the annual conference, and also her work at the Field Museum. Alaka Wali's current efforts include a collaborative multi-year project in which, quote, Native American scholarship and museum practice, end quote, are central authorities and organizing forces to develop a new Native North American hall at the Field Museum. As Alaka states, it is important for this new exhibition and the museum as a whole to acknowledge that the Chicagoland region resides on Native land. We're also thinking about who tells stories and how. The voices, narratives, and perspectives of Native peoples and indigenous nations will be anchors for the new hall, end quote. Additionally, Alaka and a colleague from the University of Illinois at Chicago are working on an exhibit featuring medicinal plants and knowledges from the diverse communities that make up Chicago. And that's an exhibit that I believe will begin in August. While not the explicit focus of today's keynote address, I believe these activities well illustrate Alaka Wali's sustained, collaborative, and creative vision of public anthropology, including that which intersects with political ecology, and the centrality of indigenous voices to this work. Thank you and welcome to Alaka Wali.
so much to the dopes. You are so impressive, and I'm here to claim a position as an elder speaking to you. So I want to tell you that I'm very inspired by all of you young folks who are organized this conference, who have given us so much to think about in your work and in your writing, and it really is truly an honor. And I really want to thank Mary and Anne for this introduction, which I don't know that I'm worthy of living up to, but so nice to be introduced by friends and close colleagues whose own work I've long admired, and so grateful to be here with all of you. I also want to begin by acknowledging, as several people have done throughout this conference, that we stand here on the lands of the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Shawnee, and the Yuchi, and many other Native folks who came before, who continue to live here, even though none are federally recognized in the state of Kentucky, and who we honor and respect for all that they have taught us. So my talk, I think you saw, was titled, well, I have to change it here, Theory, Practice, and Pragmatism. And I chose, so I chose weaving as a metaphor for this talk because I think it can deepen the concept of intersectionality, which is kind of in the air these days. Leith Mullings, who Mary mentioned, was my colleague and mentor, was one of the earliest proponents of intersectionality of race, gender, and class, and used it as a way of pointing to how forms of stratification work together to create conditions of oppression that operate on a different scale than when taken separately. Mullings used the concept of intersectionality to elevate visibility for the unique forms of oppression that African American women face, because class status in their case does not protect against the visible forms of oppression of gender and race. Intersectionality as a theory affords insights into how structures of power constrain social relationships and why and how people take action in the face of these constraints. Political ecology as a discipline or theoretical perspective has focused particularly on the intersection of power, particularly the neoliberal world economy and the natural environment. As we heard yesterday and today, bringing in feminist and critical race perspectives has already deepened our ability to gain insights into how all these are woven together to create the structure of the fabric in which we live our lives. So these are weavings. And so it all sounds good. And sometimes we get caught up in the beauty of our theoretical weavings. Certainly weavers have a design in mind that foregrounds a pattern we find aesthetically pleasing. These are Shipibo weavings from Peru. But here, sorry, my phone is, just ignore it, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. So it's nice to think about weaving and design and all of that. It sounds really good, but the metaphor runs into trouble. The relationship between theory and lived experience isn't always so beautiful. Lived experience, what theoreticians have framed as practice, that is, the way in which people craft their actions and social relationships, seems to slip the boundaries of design, work against the norms and even powerful structures. Feminist anthropologist Sherry Ortner wrote about practice building on concepts of agency and habitus to complicate our understanding of what Marx termed making history under circumstances not of our choosing. That interplay between structures of power and the actions that people take to improve their lives not only troubles our theorizing, it also has implications of how we, as scholars or activists or both, might take action to contribute to social change. To take action, I believe, it becomes important to pay attention to the constant back and forth between our theoretical understandings of power structures and the processes they generate, and the ways in which people themselves navigate those structures, live with their contradictions, and work to alter them. So today, I want to share with you some stories from our experiences at the Field Museum, working particularly focusing on the Amazon region of Peru, to illustrate how we have tried to take pragmatic action to collaborate with indigenous communities as part of our efforts to protect still healthy forest landscapes. We're an interdisciplinary group of ecologists, environmental anthropologists, geographers, and educators committed to putting the research expertise and the knowledge embedded in the museum's collections to directly impact processes of accelerating extraction and destruction we have been hearing about throughout these past few days, and certainly in all your work. These processes simultaneously threaten the environment and the livelihoods of people who depend on it. I think the processes of extraction are familiar to many of you, so I don't want to dwell on that here, but rather focus today on what we're trying to do about it at the Field Museum. And I have to say that, you know, the work we're doing has nothing to do with what we think of as normal for a museum. It isn't work it is part of the exhibit, and Restoring Earth sort of showcases the work that we've been doing in the Amazon. But the work we've been doing has really been outside of the museum, working directly with collaborators in Peru and in other places. So it's a little unusual for a museum to undertake this work, but that's another story. I'll tell you some other time. So this work I'm talking about in Peru has focused in areas that our team has worked to help protect, along with collaborators in Peru, both NGOs, local NGOs in Peru, environmental organizations there, and also government agencies. Our intervention isn't necessarily a nicely designed fabric. Instead, perhaps a patchwork that we try to constantly rework as we learn from changing conditions on the ground. So what you see on the outside here of the map, which the map with the circles is where we focus most of our efforts, what we've done is work with communities that live around these areas that have been protected by the government of Peru as conservation, either as parks or communal reserves or some kind of IUCN designation. And what we've tried to do with communities that live around these areas is we came up with a methodology that centers on helping them develop these plans, which we call quality of life plans, through which they can begin to determine where they want to go with their communities. How do they want to take care of their own communities, their own natural resources, and what are the priorities that they have for well-being of their communities. And so these plans are the outcome of listening sessions in the communities and the creation of reflective spaces where people can come together to discuss the actions they would like to take in the face of extractive pressure. So I'm going to now tell you a couple of stories of not the methodology of these plans. I've talked about that before. I can talk about that after if you're interested. I want to tell stories about what's been the outcome of some of these plans, what have been some of the efforts that the communities have undertaken with our help, with our participation. And so the first story I want to talk about is the story of Photo Voice in the Amazon, and I want to thank Justin, if he's here. Thank you for bringing out the importance of youth and working with young people. And this is a story about that, because in these listening sessions and when we create these reflective spaces, and one of the priorities that almost always come out of all the communities is over the conditions of precarity of their young people. And it's a familiar story, I think, that young people are torn between the love of family and community and the pressure to meet the demands of a national economic and social norms that pull them away from home. And so the parents express this desire to professionalize their children, to have their children have this, opportunity to go to school, because in many of the villages where we work, there's only primary school, there's no secondary school, and so on. And to, envision their kids as sort of participating in what becomes this national model of success, right? You go to school, you get a job, and you make money, all of that. And these are, I should say, these are indigenous communities that still live very much a kind of subsistence-oriented lifestyle. They're living near healthy forests, so they still have good access to hunting, fishing. They grow their own food, and so they're not, in dire straits because their forests have been degraded, but they still are pressured by these national norms that their kids should go off and go to school and so on. So that when they want that, when they feel the kids need to go to school, it becomes one of the heaviest cost burdens for families. And men often work in extractive industries to get the needed cash. So the men are off participating in illegal logging or mining at great risk to themselves to get the money to send their kids to school so that they can become profesionalizado. And so, yet families acknowledge the pain of sending youth away and the futility of it all, recognizing that in all likelihood their sons or daughters are not going to achieve the hoped for outcome. There's still rampant racist discrimination, particularly against Amazonian indigenous people. And so the chances of, even if you went to school, that you'd get a good high-paying job is not that likely. So what to do? How, when they surface this priority that they want their kids to have this opportunity to be professional, our team was thinking about what can we do to make that possible and yet not burden these families with the cost of having to go to school. So we thought of a program that we worked with Fernando Valdivia in the center here, who's a Peruvian cinematographer, and his colleague, Ronaldo Suarez, who's a Shipibo filmmaker. To train kids, we provided cameras and video equipment to train young people in 8 different communities across the Peruvian Amazon to write their own stories, to act in the stories, and to film them, and to sort of be the storytellers of their own lives, but with the idea that they would become these professionals at being able to manipulate technology and so on to do that. And so the kids, as you see in these photos, learned to use the cameras. They recruited their fellow community members to act in the films, and became the storytellers. And what was interesting to us in the stories they chose to tell often reflected not reflected their own struggles to this tension between staying in their community, validating their identity, and wanting to be part of their community, and then having to think about, what do we do? How do we make money? Or do we make money? Or how do we conserve our forests in our own way? And so the 8 films, and then they learned to edit the films and create the final product. And both young women and young men participated in the project. And so given time to reflect on what story they wanted to tell, the youth chose topics that tied them to place, to cultural identity, and confronted extractivist pressures. And so I just want to show you, it's a little clip. It's in both Shipibo and Spanish, but you don't have to understand to appreciate. I just want you to see the quality of the film that they were able to produce, and also, the way that they want to tell their story. So hopefully this will work. Oh, that's because I'm not. Sorry. Okay, now this is a still from the movie, and then here's the movie, hopefully. And this is
Muadri ki hauti osu haasha mis no koibata no huma ki kyanki no manara ipachwe.
Listo, profe.
Ah, así que esto es la comunidad de Patria Nueva, que recién conozco. Ah, esto es la comunidad Shipibo. Allá veremos. Vamos, segundo, vamos. Hoy es el gran día. Hoy ya le voy a enseñar todo de mí a esos shipibitos que no saben nada, que son analfabetos y así. Hoy sí le voy a enseñar lo que es la cultura de verdad, la cultura hispana le voy a enseñar eso. Le voy a dar duro. Aunque no sepan hablar un poco el castellano, hoy conmigo van a aprender. Yo les voy a enseñar de todo. Conmigo va.
so the kids rebel against this professor, and they don't want to follow his instructions to, only speak in Spanish and not Shipibo, and they
No
walk
sabes
out of
sal-
his classroom. And,
Segundo.
he's left there.
No me saludes en Shipibo. La próxima vez que me saludes en Shipibo. Oye, tú también, Lisa, no me interrumpas cuando estoy educando a mi hijo, ¿ya? Tú también es lo que más le educas a mi hijo. Por tu culpa me está saludando así en Shipibo. Ya, segundo, la próxima vez que me saludas, te voy a llevar a la ciudad para que aprendas a saludar como persona civilizada ya, no como así indio de la chacra. Ya.
Basi mabirusra, ha ashra misni, ha wankina kiska, no akasaiki.
Yo ya no quiero hablar en Shipibo, solo quiero hablar en castellano. Tu compañero.
Yo también no voy a hablar en Shipibo porque el profesor dice para hablar en Shipibo es una cocudeza. ¿Y tu compañera?
Yo también no voy a hablar en Shipibo. Yo también no voy a hablar.
De hoy en adelante, hablemos puro castellano, ¿ya?
It's a great little movie. It's only 8 minutes. And then finally, he leaves, and they get another teacher. Let's see. Made the film. I can stop. Yes, I can click here. Each one had a different topic that they used to illustrate all of these, difficulties and challenges they face and how they confront them. They're really nice little films. And Fernando Valdivia, we left the cameras with the communities, and we connected them to NGO that was going to continue to provide the facilities so they could continue making their videos and make other videos and edit them and so on. And Fernando Valdivia was so inspired by doing this work with these communities that he started his own project called Cine Amazonico. And now he's training all these young people in different cities in the Amazon in Peru to make movies, and now they're being presented in Lima. These young people's movies are being presented in theaters, or he's having cine festivals in Lima because, so this is like expanding the voice of these young people and giving them a voice in a city that doesn't really know. People who live in Lima, the capital of Peru, don't really know anything about the conditions of folks in the Amazon in their own 60% of their country. They learned in school, they learned the names of the Inca, the Inca rulers, but they never learn about contemporary conditions of Amazonian indigenous people. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, we do that here too. So we're really, even though we're not involved anymore in this, I think it's great. And I have to say, it's amazing to me how much the YouTube and the digital technologies have become vehicles for young people to express themselves across the globe and to sort of use that to make their own videos. My colleague at the museum, Chris Jarrett, was showing me a video of this young woman in Ecuador, an indigenous woman in Ecuador, who's making a pretty good income from making YouTube videos that are just hilarious, that are just so, taking on this whole notion of, why do we need to live like you guys? So she talks about her Lamborghini, which is the cart that she uses to carry wood back and forth from her house. You have to see it to believe it. It's really hilarious, and it's so well done. So anyway, I just think that youth empowerment, youth activism, by generating conditions that allowed them to do that, has had this impact, and hopefully it will continue to have an impact. So the second story I want to tell is about another concern that was raised in the quality of life plans that we did, which was that people in the communities wanted to generate income. So even though they have this, fairly good access to their own land and ability to make a living from the land, there's still a need for cash income. We are, after all, in a cash economy. And so they, are searching for ways to do that, but they want a source of income that didn't involve extraction, but built on the use of natural resources that were historically within their own control. So we started thinking about handcrafts as a way. Now, ethnographic literature contains a wealth of critique of handcraft projects that inevitably leave women worse off. We all probably have read about or encountered these so-called development projects, where conservation organizations kind of fell into the trap that, thinking that if they just offered income and schools and health care to communities that live around these protected areas, that these communities would be grateful for this kind of development aid, and that they would feel so much better that they wouldn't invade these parks, right? So the whole point of those projects was to perpetuate exclusion of folks from these conservation areas, and handcrafts was touted as one of those solutions to, and so, we learned from those critiques of these projects, and we wanted to try and avoid the pitfalls of that, and yet help women, get access to income in a way that made sense to them, or that could work sustainably. It's a big problem of the projects is, they start off and then there's no market, or the market dries off, or something else happens, and, and then there's very little training around how do you manage your project. Somebody comes in and tells you what to do, and then you just do it. So we try to avoid these pitfalls. We try to find people who could work with women in these communities, in our communities, that were sensitive to what kinds of technical assistance, and listen to women in terms of what they felt they needed in order to have a viable handcraft project where they could make some money off of it. And we also trained women in doing financial accounting and planning. One of the things that has been a challenge for me is that I keep thinking that our interventions can be built on what we call the assets, or the ways that people have always done things, and that if we could just fortify and reinforce the way women have always done things, which is basically to work through their own kinship networks, that would be enough to, have a successful project that gave them autonomy. But if they don't also include control of finance and other tools of market development, then they're also not they can't just rely on their own, what we call assets, or their own practices. So there has to be some way to bring these two forms together, both the market economy training and the reliance on their own ways of doing things. And so we tried that, and we were able to talk the Field Museum store into buying these handbags that were made by women in the community. And I thought, wow, we're getting somewhere. The Field Museum is always going to have a store, and they're always going to have, you know, an opportunity to buy these bags from these women. Nope. Field Museum lost interest in buying these bags. They claimed, no, they're not selling, etc. And so we learned our lesson there that, you know, I think I was being very naive in thinking that somehow I could avoid these pitfalls because, you know, engaging with the market is not something that you can just do, and it requires continued and sustained engagement from us, and we weren't there to provide that, and so it really started to fall apart. So then we, you know, we learned from that, and we thought maybe we'll just figure out a way to train NGOs that are already working with women in handcraft or other types of small income generation projects. And we created this toolkit, which incorporated some of what we'd learned from our listening sessions. I should say that our listening sessions are really doing rapid ethnography, or what Anne has called engaged listening. And I think, you know, by being able to work with what people are telling us, by even just creating in the communities these times when they can come together and talk about their own practices and what they want, that space of reflection has allowed them to sort of, you know, expand the way that they think about what they really want, which is not what they're being told they should want. And so they get a chance to really come up with their own priorities. So this is kind of the guidelines we used in our toolkit, that it would respect that people who are engaging in these income generation should respect the local forms of organization, that making the community, the women, aware that although the market provides opportunities, it also can be a failure, can bring these risks, and that they can think about this as not messing with their own natural resource base, that by, you know, balancing how much do they want to participate, you know, how much money do they really need in order to meet the needs of their families, instead of just sort of producing and producing and producing, and, you know, sort of not thinking through what money is good for or not good for, that would be something. So we built that into the toolkit, those moments of reflection. And so community, we work with NGOs to do these workshops with women. In the toolkit, and our aim was to make it fun. So many times you see NGOs go in, and the approach to these workshops or capacity building is all this didactic methods where they're standing there in front of the group and they're lecturing to the women or to the men about this is the way you should do things. And we try to, again, avoid those things because we saw that they were not working. And so we got women, well, the women played games, and they got to celebrate and enjoy learning and thinking about where they wanted to go with their handcraft project, or any other project, and then to plan for how they wanted to spend the money. A lot of times the women in the communities decided to collectively save money for collective resource buying, sharing resources, and so on. So in that case, again, Field Museum, we're not a NGO. We're not a, we see ourselves more as an interlocutor. We work with NGOs in Peru, local NGOs. We don't really work with the big conservation organizations at all. But the local NGOs, and by providing these kinds of materials, what we hope is that they will continue to sustain the effort, going forward. So, and in the handcraft or small income generation that's happening, our partners in Peru have continued to use that toolkit. So the final story I want to tell, did you raise your hand for 5 minutes? Oh, okay. The final story I want to tell is about working with the state. And I want to step back from the localized stories that I just talked about with the people and communities, to talk a little bit about the national implications of this work and what it's like to work with a neoliberal state. Now, yesterday, Diana Ojeda talked about the reluctance to work with municipal governments. Diana, you were right there. And, and to work directly with communities, and I respect that, and I think that is generally, important, and I think it's important to always start with empowering people at that very local level, which is what we've done, but ultimately, that begins to, you hit a barrier, because the local communities, they can have their quality of life plans, they can make their priorities, but unless they are able to, be in dialogue with municipal officials and with NGO actors, they cannot move those priorities forward in a way that is effective for them. So my colleague Lex Winter yesterday talked about the role of the Field Museum as a boundary spanner or as a convener, where what we've tried to do is create spaces where indigenous leaders can speak directly to NGOs and government agencies. We can bring people together in the same space and afford the opportunity for their voices to be heard by people who often don't hear those voices, don't care to hear those voices, and who have an assumptions about indigenous people who live in these places where we're working in the Amazon. So this is a map we use. It's the state of Peruvian state uses the census to characterize regions of the country as being, extremely poor or dire poverty. And so the dark red you see here is dire poverty, and then shades below that are less poverty. And poverty is defined by, I don't know if I can, oh, no. Can you see? You can't really see the legend there, I'm sorry. Well, it got cut off. But poverty is defined by per capita income, right? GDP. And so in these places where we work, where these communities are not making a lot of money, their per capita income is very low, right? And they're characterized as extremely poor. But when we do our listening sessions with the communities, when we talk to them about, well, what do you have and what do you not have, most of the time, they come out with a sense of their quality of life as being really good. So the blue dots you see there on the map are people's villages that have characterized their own quality of life as being quite high. I mean, you know, a beautiful life, not a life of poverty at all, because they have autonomy over their control of their own resources. They have fish. They tell their own stories to themselves. You know, they have this, they have what they value. And so this kind of work has led me and led our group to, you know, think through, and now it's become in Latin America as an alternative to development theory, right? So if the development theory says everyone has to be, that development or success or out of poverty means your per capita income is high, that you're doing, you know, whatever it is you're doing to make money, etc. This theory called Buen Vivir, which is taking hold among theoreticians in Latin America now, but comes from the vision of Amazonian people, from their cosmovision. They have a very different way of defining what is a good life, what is Buen Vivir. And the values are not the values of a capitalist economy or an extractive economy. The values are based in creating sustained, deep relationships with each other and with their, you know, non-human relatives, so to speak. And so those values guide their vision of what is a good life. And they've put that, indigenous organizations in Peru and throughout the Amazon have put that into writing. You can read their own writing about Buen Vivir, about full life, plena vida. So I think that is an alternative theory. It's a way of thinking that, again, this dialogue between the lived reality and what emerges as a fabric for thinking about the world. It helps us when we listen to people and what they're telling us. So our job then is to bring that cosmovision, that sense of values that people have that's so different to you know, park officials, to NGOs. And over the past 20 years, we've really been trying to improve the tools that we're using, the methodologies. We need to make more improvements. Obviously, it's a process. But I think it's starting to take hold in Peru. And the concept of Buen Vivir, the concept that community voice needs to be accounted for in planning, is starting to be taken seriously by people in the environmental ministry, you know, only there, not in the mining ministry, but at least in the environment ministry. They're starting to marry their planning documents, which are very technocratic. Oh, I forgot. Sorry, I'm not changing the, what happened here? Oh, here. Marrying our quality of life planning process and guide with their technocratic planning for regional development, and incorporating community voice into their planning processes. So this is a hopeful moment. And this is the final slide here. And this is at the IUCN conference last fall in Peru. My colleagues, Tita Elvira, Ana Lemos, Michelle Castro, are with Lucia Ruiz, who at the time was the Minister of the Environment. She had worked with us when she was just part of an NGO that we started working with some 20 years ago. And then she rose to be Minister of the Environment, and she insisted that this methodology of quality of life planning be adopted by the entire ministry, working with communities, giving central place to community participation in the design of park management and so on. So now she's no longer Minister of Environment, so things go on, but there's always something to the dialogue, the back and forth. So these are some of our collaborators over the years. I'm thankful that Anne and Mary pointed out to the collaborative nature of the work we do at the Field Museum. It really is the only way to do this work. And it not only is the only way, but it's really the most joyful way to do this work. Because when you work with local folks, with local organizations, it does give you hope. It does inspire you. And even though we've made so many mistakes along the way, it's really been, for me, such a privilege to be in these spaces, to learn from the cosmovision of indigenous people. And I like to end by saying that people, you know, in our discourses, in our theories, we talk about oppression, we talk about marginalized people, we put them into that frame because we want to foreground the ways that neoliberalism is oppressive. But when you think about what folks like these communities in the Amazon have created and what they continue to create, I see them as the avant-garde, not as the marginal. They are telling us, they are showing us how to live, not just in their environment, but in our environment too. How we can live, how can we be joyful, be hopeful, be inspired. I think, Diana, I'll also draw back from you when you were talking about, you know, the person told you that he didn't have the luxury to be pessimistic. And I think that's what we learn from folks in these places. And so I just want you to flip that narrative and to think about the people that you're gonna go work with in these, when you do your field research or when you're theorizing, listen to people, consider them your teachers, your avant-garde, and not as the backwards or marginalized folks. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Wali. That was amazing. We're opening this up to questions now.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I'm curious to know what it was like to come in as the director at a museum that's historically been known for being sort of, well, people generally know what their history is for, but to come in as the director of a community engaged center and sort of what space you were able to make, what leeway you were given, what leeway you had to take, and sort of how that process worked.
Man, all the dirty stories. I was actually, you know, I had no idea what I was getting into when I started at the Field Museum because I'd never been in a museum. I mean, as a member of a staff, obviously. And so, but they said they wanted this kind of community relevant. They wanted to make the museum relevant. They said, just do it. And they didn't give me any money. So that tells you something. But they gave me the space to do what I wanted. And so I started just, you know, by the seat of my pants. And I started by working with urban communities first, working with the Chicago organizations. And it was really, you know, a lot of small organizations, as I think and talked about the Chicago Cultural Alliance, the work we did with small ethnic heritage-based museums. That was among our first efforts. And they were really, the Field Museum has standing in Chicago. It has a reputation, and fortunately, people want to be engaged by the Field Museum. So if you can build trust, if you can, listen, then people are happy, they want to work. They see it as an opportunity to expand their voice. So we were able to build a lot of relationships with community organizations. As long as I could raise the money to do it, I was able to do it. And so that kind of was going along, and then I reached a wall, I was saying to somebody, because foundations aren't really, they didn't want to keep funding that work because it started to look like social justice and social change, and while I was a museum taking that on, I should have been focused on doing exhibits. That was kind of like I could see I was going to reach a wall. So I partnered with my colleague who was doing all this environmental conservation work in the Amazon, but also in Chicago. And she was able to raise a lot of money for conservation work, because, we need to conserve the Amazon, right? That's a trope that sticks to foundations. She got $12 million from the Moore Foundation to do the work in the Amazon. But then she realized that just doing ecology, just providing the scientific data for why these areas should be conserved was not going to protect them, and that she would need to work with communities in that area for long-term sustainability with NGO partners. So that's, she asked me if I would join my center with her center, and that's how we were able to continue this work. And again, she had to raise all her money too. This was not something where the Field Museum just said, we're giving you money to do this. But she was a better fundraiser than I am. Does that answer your? Way up.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the use of people's handicrafts and art as a means of both creating funds for them to empower themselves and also provide work, but also as a tool of educating people in this, in the U.S. about their cultures without fetishizing their culture and their stories.
Yeah, we tried to do that with our Field Museum store. When the handbags were available for sale in the museum store, we had, sort of labels. We turned it into kind of a little exhibit in the store to talk about, what this meant to the communities and why, they wanted to do this, why they wanted to sell their handcrafts, and what it meant to them to have that income so that they didn't have to participate in illegal logging and so on. So, but generally, it's, and then we have this exhibition, Restoring Earth, where we talk about that. And in the exhibit, we have a little video where we try to make the case that, I think it was, where is he? He was sitting right there. Jonathan Hall was saying today, who is the we? Who are the humans who are complicit in the destruction of this environment? It's not the people who live there. It's not the indigenous people. They didn't cause the destruction. And so we can't lump all these people together. We have to acknowledge the economic, systems and political systems of capitalism, which is what's directly responsible And we talk about that in our exhibit, and that the folks that live in that place are the ones who are protecting that place. You know, it's not the big NGOs, it's not the big conservation organizations by and large. So we tried to do that, and what role the Handcraft Project plays. It's in our exhibit, so come to the Field Museum. But it's a small part of educating.
I see you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wali. This is maybe more of a comment or a reflection, especially given your last response. As you were talking about working with the women to obtain accounting skills, financial planning and management skills, I reflected on my own time as an undergrad and how I, as a woman, I had a liberal arts degree I was pursuing, but I also tacked on business because I really wanted that financial literacy, accounting, and so forth. But in my time in business school, I remember the only ethical imperative was to maximize profits, and I'm not exaggerating. That was all that they taught us. That was our responsibility. And I thought how much that community toolkit and the lessons that you mentioned about money, those lessons would have been valuable for American business students, and really I think could be part of that thinking. It's not people in the Amazon that are causing the destruction, but it's implicated in our larger economic systems and in our American business schools. So thank you for bringing up those points.
Well, thank you. And I think, you know, when the 2008, you know, when the economic crisis hit here in the United States, and we learned that, you know, people were losing their homes here in this country because of having taken on unsustainable burdens of debt. You know, I had this thought about how, well, people in the Amazon, these indigenous communities, are always being told they don't know how to handle money. It's their problem. That's how come they're in such dire poverty, because they don't know how to handle money. And I'm thinking 99% of the world doesn't know how to handle money. We're all in that same boat. And you're right that, you know, these kinds of ways of bringing, you know, capacity and giving people the time to reflect. And I think that's really been the best part of what we've done, because we made a lot of mistakes and failed at stuff. But the best part of what we've done is you just give people this space. You know, you come in, they're working, they don't, you know, they have their community meetings, but those meetings are dedicated to solving, you know, community governance problems. And so when we create a space where they can reflect on other aspects of their life and on their values, and we use our listening sessions and we say, here's what you told us about, you know, what you value, what do you think? And then that helps them, you know, strengthens their resolve to not go the route of, you know, I need more money, I need more cash, and how am I going to get it? So, but yeah, we all need that. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. Going back to a point you made earlier, thinking about this notion of these communities as guardians or protectors of the forest, thinking about my own work with communities in Misiones, Argentina, so subtropical forest. One of the tensions I really run into, and I would love your reflections on this, is thinking about, you know, while at the same time there's all of this pressure on these forests, I think there's also pressure on these communities to sort of be protectors of the forest or to perform protection of the forest. And I guess I was thinking, like, what is your, how do you guys deal with that in terms of not kind of requiring that performance of like indigenous environmental authenticity from these communities? And what are the risks, in particularly in doing this through things like handicrafts or other things? Like, yeah, where do you see that operating, or where do you intervene in that process in educating, particularly through the museum?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, it is, it's easy to fall into that trap. And I think like my colleagues who are ecologists, you know, they started off initially with the assumptions that all humans are bad, that all humans are destroyers of the forest, as Jonathan was saying earlier today, that, you know, that the conservation ethic is we, the, you know, white conservationists, we the ones who are going to protect this landscape. And those people are, then they switch and they said, oh, indigenous people, there can be our allies. They can be the ones who can, you know, work with us. And, you know, so they went what you're saying, the opposite to the romanticizing of indigenous people. And they started putting a lot of strictures on indigenous people. You can't fish in the protected area. You can't hunt. You know, the peccary is endangered. All of that. So we did have to have a lot of conversation and reflection in our own team and with our local partners around those issues, and to get over this notion that folks, you know, are some kind of, you know, automatic. They're not protectors, and they shouldn't have to be. You know, it's not up to them. Again, they didn't cause the problem. So it's not their responsibility to be the sole protectors. I agree with that, you know, but how do they want to live their lives? And that's the question we pose. So if they are telling us how they want to live their life, and we're surfacing that and saying, you know, these are their priorities, then we can work with that to build partnerships that are protective of these landscapes and protective of their own cultural practices. So that's kind of, you know, where we aim to be, somewhere in that zone.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Down here.
Thank you so much. I think this is fascinating and really inspiring and ambitious for a museum. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, or your reflections on, conveying the really kind of radical methodology you're aiming for in a museum for an audience that might not be expecting this, you know, you're kind of countering dominant models of conservation, countering dominant models of development, countering, you know, the kind of exoticizing museum coloniality, all as well as the breadth of the Shipobo Cosmovision and these projects. So how did that look, or even the kind of conveying or exhibition aspect for a museum goer?
I don't know, we just did it. I mean, I think that I was very fortunate that my closest colleague, Deborah Moskowitz, who was the director of the Environment and Conservation Program. So a lot of this is really personal too, you know, it's not just some theoretical, again, you know, thing, but she got it. She saw something in working across these disciplinary boundaries and allowing anthropology to inform how we were going to work on conservation. And so initially she said, Alaka, you're just doing magic, you know, the communities are all on board with working with us, how wonderful. And I said, it's not magic, Debbie, it's science, it's anthropology, it's theory that tells us that, you know, that people resist or restore, or however we want to frame it, that they are acting in their own interests, and that they have held on to values that are different from ours. That's what anthropology teaches us. I think it's beginning to infuse political ecology as well. So if folks have over 500 years or more have held on to values that are that different from ours, that are telling us, something that we better be open to listening to, then it's, that's I said, it's our obligation to make that commitment. And Debbie got that because she's passionate about that landscape and wanting to protect it, and she became passionate about the people too, although she'll never admit that. But so I think, we were very fortunate that the two of us, were able to have a way of creating this team. And that team, you saw, those are folks who are continuing the work. Jacob is here, Pasama is here. They're all part of that effort. And it is kind of a unique space. The Keller Science Action Center is what it's called now, that can do this work and, and think through these interdisciplinary approaches, which we really need in order to do action, to make a change. Yeah.
All right, if y'all could thank Dr. Wali one more time.
Thank you.
And Olivia has a few more announcements for us. And can we also give Olivia a hand as our chair this year?
Thank you. So thank you to Dr. Alaka Wali for an incredible talk tonight. And thank you so much to all of our speakers at this conference, Dr. Rebecca Elmhurst, Dr. Justin Dunavant, Dr. Macarena Gomez-Barres, and Dr. Diana Ojeda. Also, a special thanks to this incredible scholar activists that we had today, Johari Colquelli, Elaine Loskamp, Alice Melendez, and Ashley Smith, and as well our Dope at 10 organizer panel. Thank you so much for coming out.